When I was younger, I was told I was never allowed to leave my room after 9 p.m. and one night I discovered why. Part 1. Submitted by You Shall Not Pass 121. Growing up, I lived with strictly conservative parents, and it's been something that I have been trying and failing to leave behind all of my life. I don't want to delve in too deep into my childhood memories on this thread as it's been something that I've been avoiding, although my therapist says that talking is good, so I've been trying to follow her advice and openly discuss my childhood traumas with anyone who would listen. No one really wants to listen, though. No one wants to listen about my incredibly overbearing parents, the weird rules they had, about how I wasn't ever allowed to have friends around, never allowed out the house past 7 p.m., and under no circumstances was I ever allowed out of my bedroom after 9 p.m. My parents never told me why. They just said it was when they could have their special time. Whatever that meant. They made sure I abided by their rules by locking me in my room at night so that I couldn't sneak around even if I wanted to. This became a regular everyday occurrence and something that I slowly grew accustomed to, until I no longer asked questions, no longer cried when they told me for the 16th time that my then friend Susan wasn't allowed in the house, and no longer worried them every hour for a glass of water or the bathroom. They installed a kind of small cat flap into my room when I turned 10, outside of which they left me glasses of water and snacks if I got hungry. By this point, I was pretty much toilet trained and no longer needed to use the bathroom several times a night, which meant I no longer needed the toilet bucket they had been providing me with for as long as I can remember. Great parents, they were, right? The only time I ever enjoyed living there with them was around the holidays. Christmas was the best time as I was never locked in my room at night, and this was because my parents once said that Christmas is the only time that they take a break from their special hobby. I never knew what the hobby was, and I was never allowed to ask. I did once and was locked away at 8 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. I never asked again after that. I hated it, because I wasn't even allowed to keep my lights on either. I was just supposed to get in bed and sleep immediately. What child can ever go to sleep straight away? Several uneventful years passed. I grew accustomed to my daily routine: wake up, go to school, come back, read a book, go to bed, wake up, and repeat. My mental health, however, was declining slowly but surely. I felt incredibly lonely all the time and became very introverted, even in school. My friends didn't understand, so they stopped talking to me. My parents, well, I wasn't a priority to them, so it isn't something that overly concerned them. They thought it was just teenage hormones, not the fact that they kept locking me away in my room every night for years and not at all bothering to explain why. On the eve of my 13th birthday, October 4, 1999, I decided it was time to find out. It was a pleasant evening, mild and ordinary. I'd been quiet most of the day, but that's nothing unusual, especially not to my parents, so they thought nothing of it when I decided to retire to my room early, 7:30 p.m. in fact. They didn't ask any questions, didn't even flinch. Both of them just sat there, looking somewhat despondent, but I thought it best not to ask questions. I'd learned that the hard way by now. My plan was to wait until midnight, and I would climb out of the window and let myself back into the house with the keys that my parents never even knew I had. I waited patiently. Time was all that I had, and filling empty hours and staring at walls has become somewhat of a pastime for me. I was excited to finally break the monotony. Nervousness was an entirely alien feeling to me, so all I could do was sit and wait. Once it hit midnight, I stood up and went to my window. I'd learned how to be extremely quiet by now, so I didn't make a sound. Our house was quite dull, and my bedroom was on the 3rd floor, so I was hesitant, of course, but I was quite a tall child by then, so didn't worry too much about a sudden fall or slipping off the roof. I had been planning this for quite some time and was heavily prepared, and also, as I had mentioned, I was somewhat adept to my lack of emotion. I walked over to my bedroom window and opened it. It was easy. My windows were never locked because my parents didn't take me to be the gutsy type. I had always been quite a timid child, quiet and receptive, so I knew they wouldn't expect this sort of behavior from me, and plus, they'd drilled those impulses from me long ago now. With their cruelty. But I needed to find out what went on in the house. That urge was more powerful than the fear of the repercussions I would receive, should I be discovered. I'm digressing, I do apologize. I was on the roof of my home, crawling slowly. I did this to avoid being seen and to minimize the noise that I made when I heard a sound. It was coming from the direction of my parents' bedroom. I was crawling past their window. Annoyingly, their curtains were shut, so I couldn't see anything. But that sound, it was peculiar, to say the least. I crawled a little closer and realized that it was the sound of hushed whispers. The words were muffled but in unison. It almost sounded like a chant of some kind. It was just me and my parents in this house, but the sound that emanated from the bedroom, it seemed like there were at least 10 people in there. It made me feel really uncomfortable, scared even, and that's not something that I was used to. It did, however, urge me to continue. I was even more intent on finding out what my parents were doing. I continued to crawl until I came to the roof of the second floor of the house. I was then able to get all the way down to the ground. The house was shrouded in darkness. I knew it was midnight, but still, it was sinister, eerie. I walked towards the front door and opened it with the key that I had hidden at the bottom of my shoe. I opened it slowly to ensure that it didn't creak. It was an old house. What I saw as soon as I stepped through the door were candles absolutely everywhere. There was a candle on every single free space in the downstairs front room, kitchen, guest room, and even in the bathroom. I didn't even know that we had this many candles in the house. I continued to take small, cautious steps forward, until I came to the bottom of the stairs. I could hear the chanting again. So I began to ascend the stairs. The closer I got to the top, the louder the chanting became. I couldn't hear what language it was, but it most definitely wasn't English. Eventually, I was homeschooled, and my parents wanted me to learn as many languages as I could, so as I got closer, I perhaps thought that it sounded like Russian, but I didn't think it was a comprehensible dialect, not one that normal people spoke anyway. The candles lined the upstairs hallway. Every single closed door had 2 candles either side of them, except mine. I suddenly heard a quick shuffling behind me. I turned around, but the darkness in this house was so impenetrable that I couldn't make anything out. I looked down. In front of my parents' bedroom, in the space that was illuminated by the 2 candles, I saw a pair of feet. I backed away quickly but realized that I couldn't get back into my bedroom because I didn't have a key and, of course, it was locked. I felt what I assumed was panic surge through me, so I quickly went into the bathroom opposite and locked the door. Candles illuminated the room, albeit dimly. I tried to turn the lights on, but they wouldn't work. I flipped the switch up and down a few times to no avail. That was when I heard the shuffling again, but outside the door this time, which was then followed by a quiet but distinct knock. The knocking was slow, distinct, and it made my skin crawl. "Mom? Dad?" I called out. No answer. The knocking continued. As much as my parents were cruel and uncaring towards me, I knew they wouldn't do this. Someone else must be in the house. I couldn't understand though. We weren't allowed visitors, it was strictly forbidden. Perhaps that was only the case where I was concerned though, it wouldn't be surprising. I couldn't be sure. I sat on the edge of the bath for a while, keeping as still and as quiet as I possibly could. The knocking eventually stopped, and I heard the sound of feet shuffling, moving away from the bathroom door, their movements slow and deliberate. I waited a further few minutes just to be sure before I proceeded to slowly unlock and open the door. I was hesitant to leave the safety of the bathroom, but I couldn't stay in there forever. I took a step forward. Now let me tell you the bizarre thing I encountered when I found myself back on the landing again. As I mentioned before, the candles lined all the doors. There was a candle on either side. Candles all along the hallway, and all they did was illuminate the floor. Looking straight on, you couldn't see anything as the darkness was so thick, but the floors were visible. That's how I was able to see the feet in the first place but not see the body they belonged to. I couldn't explain it. Something else happened that I couldn't fathom. Our landing suddenly looked different, strange in fact. I was beginning to feel fear. It was spreading through me like wildfire. The upstairs landing seemed infinite. It was a ridiculous notion, of course, but it really did seem like it went on forever. Candles lined it as far as I could see. I turned around and saw nothing. The stairs, the doors, and the candles that lined them were all gone. What is going on? I whispered to no one, more to myself. It was then that I heard a cackle. It echoed around the whole place, got louder and louder until I felt like I could hear it in my head. It stopped as quickly as it started, and I uncovered my ears when I suddenly heard it again. But this time, directly behind me. I didn't turn around, I just ran down the infinite hallway until I felt like I was far enough away to warrant stopping. There was nowhere to hide here. I had no choice but to continue walking, so I did just that. I walked and walked until I came across an open book. It was so strange. An open book in the middle of an empty hallway? I know, I found it just as bizarre. What was even more bizarre, it's that it was one of my fairy tale books. One of my favorites in fact. It was a book of Slavic fairy tales, which outlined many fantastic tales, but this one especially had a particular story about the Baba Yaga. A little background: as I mentioned, my parents were very cruel to me. I never felt loved, never felt anything, really. So growing up, I delved into books. I would rather escape into a fantastical reality than be in my isolated one, so I read a lot. I had a particular fondness for fairy tales, for obvious reasons, so I got my hands on as many as I could. My parents encouraged this, so I had no issues getting hold of whatever books I wanted. One Christmas, when my parents ceased their special time, and I was no longer confined to my bedroom, albeit for a short while, they got me a present. It was something I didn't expect. They have never gotten me a gift in my life, not on Christmas and especially not for my birthday, so it was certainly out of character for them. The book was called Russian Fairy Tales, and it wasn't a book that I'd ever heard of before, so as much as I was reserved about this gift, I took it gladly. And plus, I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Who knows what they would have done if I was. It was a fascinating read, it really was. Although, I won't say that it wasn't somewhat peculiar, especially the Baba Yaga story. So there was this book, my book, on the floor, in the middle of the landing. Surrounded by candles. It was open on the Baba Yaga story. The Baba Yaga was a folklore story as old as time itself, retold and remolded many times. As I discovered after reading the book. The essence of the story is that the Baba Yaga is an old woman, a witch they say, and she is known to be mistakenly summoned by lost travelers. She appears to them, first in their dreams and then only at night. Another important aspect of the story is that she can be summoned to grant wishes. But at a price. The most common facet of the story is that she likes to harvest the souls of children. She cooks the children that she lures to her hut, deep in the woods, and she would first cook them in her large cooking pot, before devouring their heart, whilst it was still beating. Apparently, this was how she would harvest their souls. She was known to keep them alive for a while first, harvesting bits of their flesh. She needs children's souls to harness her power, which has an air of mystery around it and hasn't much been explained in any of the books that I read. Her appearance, as described in my book, is probably the most terrifying. The Baba Yaga is very old, very skinny, and horrendously ugly. She is often described to be grotesque, her body malformed. She has a long distorted nose, mostly covered in warts, and long, iron teeth. Her nails are long and sharp. She is described to have the most skin-crawling cackle. As I said, a fascinating story. I approached the book, slowly. Confused as to why it was there when I heard a very distant but distinct scraping. It sounded like something, or someone was scraping the walls behind me, as they walked. I backed away, but I quickly picked up the book and took it with me. I had no choice but to go forward. The scraping was getting closer and closer to me, and I had no desire to meet whoever or whatever was doing it. I walked, and I walked fast. Where were my parents? I hadn't seen any doors or any windows ever since I left the confines of the bathroom. I was too scared to call out, in case whatever it was that was following me heard. I continued on for a while until I came across a painting. I could still hear the distant scraping, getting closer. It was the same as the book, surrounded by candles, and it was a painting that I'd never seen in our house. It depicted a house that stood in the middle of the woods, an old disused wooden hut that was supported by long, blood-covered chicken legs. The lights from the candles were faint, so I had to get a little closer to see the detail. In the doorway of the house, stood a little old woman, and she was smiling, her mouth absolutely covered in blood. I cannot explain the fear that was coursing through my body. I'd never felt anything like it. I needed to get away from this painting. I continued walking, heavily disturbed, and what I saw then stopped me dead in my tracks. A little further away from me, lay a human heart. Surrounded by candles, and it was still beating.